Is a video to help you understand the lesson on trouble with taxes. So this is our third learning target related to the road to the revolution. We've looked already at how distinct regions developed during the colonial period. We've looked at the causes and effects of the French and Indian War. Now we're going to identify major causes of tension between the colonists and the British. This relates to our essential question of how did taxation and political control lead to increasing tension between the British and the American colonists, and of course relates to our overall unit question of what is worth fighting for. So, to recap from the French and Indian War, remember that the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and one of the final results of that conflict was that King George of Britain forbid all colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, which was a big deal because that was the whole purpose of fighting the war. So from the colonists' perspective, they were trying to gain control of the Ohio River Valley, and now they were being told that they could not go and live in that land that they had just rightfully won. Furthermore, we talked about how war is very expensive. So the British debt at the conclusion of the war was 122 million pounds, which in today's money is roughly $30 billion. So in order to pay for the debt on that war, the British raised taxes on the colonists. That really upset the colonists because they did not have any say in deciding the taxes on those colonies. And so they had fought a war to gain this land, and now they felt like they were not being given the right to live in that territory that they had successfully won, and they're being taxed without their consent. So taxes are going to be a major issue between the colonists and the British, and here are some specific examples of those taxes related to the French and Indian War. The first act, it's not specifically a tax, but one act that came as a result of the French and Indian War was the Quartering Act of 1765. So the British wanted to keep some troops in the colonies after the French and Indian War to kind of keep an eye on things, make sure that nothing boiled over, we didn't have a repeat of anything. And paying for those soldiers, giving them housing, shelter, clothing, all of those things will be very expensive. So to save some money, King George decided that he would use the colonists to help. So he wrote the Quartering Act, which would require colonists to provide shelter, food, supplies for those soldiers who would be keeping an eye on things. So their purpose was to maintain peace after the conflict. It did not require colonists to give up their homes. That will come later on. But it did require colonists to provide some assistance so that the costs of maintaining these soldiers in the colonies could be kept down. Colonists were very frustrated by this, of course. Some of them questioned the need for troops when the war was already over, and so some of them just refused to comply. They didn't go along with it. So that's the Quartering Act. The Sugar Act, and this is where we get into some of those specific taxes, was written in 1764. This is a tax on molasses specifically. So there was a tax that had long been in effect from 1733, but that tax was about to expire. And it was hardly ever paid because oftentimes individuals with ships, they would simply smuggle their sugar from places like the Caribbean into the colonies, and it wasn't really enforced. So no one was really checking to make sure that the tax on this molasses was paid for. So the Sugar Act actually reduced the rate of the tax, so it made it a lesser amount, but the British government decided they would enforce the collection. They would actually be checking to make sure that people were paying for the sugar that they were bringing in. The colonists were nervous about this. They were upset about it because they feared that it would make sugar too expensive, and they all loved tea. I mean, who doesn't love sugar? So they were afraid that this tax would make sugar too expensive for them to buy. And so some of them protested against the act. They even boycotted sugar. So they refused to purchase sugar or use it in their products. Sugar taxes are still a thing. So there have been proposed sugar taxes even today. So this is one from Philadelphia and relating it to Pittsburgh as well. If you're a fan of the show Parks and Recreation, there's an episode about a tax on sugar. All right, next is the Stamp Act from 1765. So this was a tax on the colonists after the French and Indian War, where the colonists would have to pay a tax for every piece of paper that they used in the colonies. So any legal documents, any newspapers that they would purchase, they would have to pay a very small amount. It's a small tax, but it's the first direct tax on the colonists without their consent, which is significant. So you can survive without sugar and avoid having to pay the tax on sugar from the Sugar Act. But it's kind of impossible to avoid using paper in the colonies in the 1760s. So that's why we consider it a direct tax. It applies to everyone, and they were not asked for their opinion on it. So it's without their consent. It only lasted for 1 year, but this one really upset the colonists. Some of them petitioned the government trying to get it repealed, which ultimately they were able to do. Some of them protested. But significantly, it also led to the Stamp Act Congress, which is the first time that the colonies got together, that they established leaders who would meet and talk about these issues that they're having with the British. So the Stamp Act Congress, this first meeting of the colonies against British decisions, it's because of the Stamp Act. Next is the Townshend Acts from 1767. So this was an import tax on things being shipped into the colonies. So these would be materials like china, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And the colonists, these are taxes on things that they cannot produce on their own, so they would have to be imported. And again, colonists upset about this, organized boycotts of British goods. So the Sons of Liberty, we'll see them throughout this unit, were organized to help put together these protests and boycotts against British goods. In some cases, like in the New England colonies and in the colony of New York, they simply refused to import British goods for an entire year. So they shut down their ports that will be importing these British goods as a response to the Townshend Acts. And ultimately, no taxation without representation would become this rallying cry of the colonists who were upset about all of these things. So these boycotts, the refusal to buy particular goods in protest, became very common. The Sons of Liberty, which we just mentioned, were a secret society that were formed by these unhappy colonists to help plan out their resistance to the British crown. Samuel Adams was the leader of these Sons of Liberty. And they did a lot of things like seizing British tax officials and harassing them. So giving them a hard time, making them feel very unwelcome, and in some cases even injuring them, like what you see in this image here of a tax collector being tarred and feathered. So the colonial response to these taxes from the French and Indian War was very negative and was ultimately a source of major division between the colonists and the British.